Serial killers. People always seem to be interested in what gruesome acts they've committed and their own unique stories. Even though the things they've done are so horrible, people seem to not care and end up loving murder books, movies, or TV shows. And so why not add an iceberg to that list of ways to learn about serial killers and what they've done? So, as you probably already know, this video will cover the serial killer iceberg, starting with well-known and somewhat popular serial killers to some that are so disturbing and gruesome that their stories are often hidden. And of course, disclaimer, this video will dive into some scary, gross, and downright disturbing content, and I'll try my best to not over-dramatize it, but still get the facts said. I'll censor things when it needs to be, but without further ado, let's get into the serial killer iceberg. And actually, before we dive into the video, consider subscribing. It's my goal to be at 50,000 subs by the end of the year, and it'd be really awesome if you could help contribute to that goal. It's free, and you can always change your mind. Now, without further ado, let's get into the video. Alright, starting off with Tier 1, obviously, and starting with Jeffrey Dahmer, also known as the Milwaukee Cannibal or the Milwaukee Monster. He was an American serial killer who gained notoriety in the 1990s. He was born on May 21st, 1960, in West Allis, Wisconsin, and his crimes took place in and around Milwaukee. Dahmer is one of the most infamous serial killers in American history. Dahmer's crimes came to light in 1991 when police discovered photographs of dismembered bodies in his apartment. He was subsequently arrested, and during the investigation, it was revealed that he had lured and murdered 17 young men between 1978 and 1991. His most common crime was involved drugging his victims, engaging in SA with them, and then dismembering their bodies. He also engaged in acts of necrophilia and cannibalism. In 1992, Jeffrey Dahmer was convicted of 16 murders and sentenced to 16 consecutive life terms in prison, totaling 936 years in prison, without the possibility of parole. While in prison, he was then killed by a fellow inmate in 1994. Dahmer's case shocked the nation and led to a renewed discussion about the criminal justice system, the treatment of mental illness, and the responsibility of law enforcement in handling such cases. His life and crimes have been subject of numerous books, documentaries, and films. John Wayne Gacy, often referred to as the Killer Clown, was an American serial killer who gained notoriety for his heinous crimes in the 1970s. He was born on March 17, 1942, in Chicago, Illinois. Gacy was known for his double life, appearing as a community-minded, friendly individual while secretly leading to a gruesome life as a serial killer. Between 1972 and 1978, Gacy SA'd and murdered at least 33 young men and boys. He often lured his victims to his home under the pretense of offering them employment, money, or simply by impersonating a police officer. Once at his house, he would subdue and then murder them. Gacy's most common crime involved strangulation or suffocation, and he buried many of his victims beneath his house or discarded their remains in a nearby river. Gacy was eventually arrested in December 1978 after police discovered evidence linking him to the disappearances of several different young men. In 1980, he was tried and convicted of multiple counts of murder. He was sentenced to death and spent many years on death row in Illinois. In 1994, John Wayne Gacy was executed by lethal injection by the Stateville Correctional Center in Crest Hill, Illinois. His case remains one of the most infamous and disturbing in the history of American serial killers, and his dual identity as a community volunteer and a serial killer contributed to the fascination and horror surrounding his crimes. Charles Manson was an American criminal and cult leader who gained infamy for his role in orchestrating a series of gruesome murders in the late 1960s. He was born on November 12, 1934, in Cincinnati, Ohio, and died on November 19, 2017, while serving a life sentence in prison. But Manson was the leader of a cult-like group known as the Manson family. In 1969, he and his followers, which included young men and women, committed a series of brutal murders in and around Los Angeles, California. The most famous of these murders was the killing of the pregnant actress Sharon Tate and several others at her home. Manson believed in an apocalyptic vision he referred to as the Helter Skelter, which he interpreted as a coming race war between whites and African Americans. He believed that by committing gruesome murders and blaming them on other racial groups, he would incite this war. In 1971, Manson and several of his followers were arrested and tried for their involvement in the murders. Manson and several of his followers were initially sentenced to death, but their sentences were commuted to life imprisonment after the California Supreme Court invalidated the state's death penalty statute. Charles Manson case has been the subject of intense public fascination in numerous books, movies, and documentaries. His ability to manipulate and control his followers, as well as the shocking and gruesome nature of the crimes committed by his cult, make him one of the most notorious and disturbing figures in criminal history. Ted Bundy was an American serial killer who terrorized several states in the 1970s. He was born on November 24, 1946 in Burlington, Vermont, and was executed in the electric chair on January 24, 1989 in Florida. Bundy is one of the most infamous and prolific serial killers in all of American history. Bundy was known for his good looks, charisma, and ability to gain trust of his victims. He used these traits to lure young women to their deaths. The way he killed typically involved approaching young women, often faking injury or pretending to be an authority figure, and then overpowering them. He would then abduct, torture, and eventually murder them. Afterward, he would engage in acts of necrophilia and return to his crime scenes to further degrade their remains. Bundy's killing spree extended from the early 1970s through his capture in 1975. He was linked to the murders of at least 30 young women, although the actual number of victims may have been much higher. Bundy was captured in 1975 and later convicted of multiple counts of murder. During his trials and imprisonment, Bundy displayed a high degree of intelligence and manipulative charm. He managed to escape from custody twice, once in 1975 and again in 1977. Each time he was recaptured. Ultimately, Bundy was sentenced to death for his crimes, and he spent years on death row in various states. He was then electrocuted in an electric chair at Florida State Prison in 1989. Ted Bundy's life and crimes have been subject of numerous books, documentaries, and films. Son of Sam is the nickname given to David Berkowitz, an American serial killer who terrorized New York City in the summer of 1977. Berkowitz was born on June 1, 1953 in Brooklyn, New York. He carried out a series of shootings, primarily targeting young couples, and he was known for his random and seemingly unprovoked attacks. Berkowitz's killing spree began in July 1976 and continued all the way to 1977. During his time, he killed 6 people and wounded several others. He often used a .44 caliber bulldog revolver in his attacks. The random nature of his shootings and the cryptic letters he sent to the media and police created a climate of fear and panic in New York City. Berkowitz was eventually arrested on August 10, 1977, after a parking ticket led to the police to his car, which contained a weapon matching the ballistics evidence from the shootings. Upon his arrest, he confessed to the Son of Sam murders. Berkowitz claimed that he was influenced by a demon who possessed his neighbor's dog, which was why he referred to himself as the Son of Sam in letters to the police. He later admitted that he made up his story. In 1978, David Berkowitz pleaded guilty to the murders and was sentenced to 6 consecutive 25-year to life terms in prison. Jack the Ripper is the nickname given to an unidentified serial killer who operated in and around the Whitechapel district of London in 1888. The identity of Jack the Ripper remains one of the most famous unsolved mysteries in the history of criminal investigations. The killer is believed to have been responsible for a series of gruesome and brutal murders, primarily targeting prostitutes in the Whitechapel area. The victims were typically women, and the bodies were found with severe mutilations, particularly to their abdomens and throats. The precise number of victims attributed to Jack the Ripper is still a matter of debate among historians, but there are generally 5 widely recognized canonical victims: Mary Ann Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. The name Jack the Ripper originated from a series of taunting letters sent to the police and newspapers by someone claiming to be the killer. The authenticity of these letters is also subject to debate. despite extensive investigations and numerous suspects, the true identity of Jack the Ripper has never been conclusively established. Over the years, many theories and subjects have been proposed, but the case still remains unsolved. The mystery of Jack the Ripper has fueled countless books, documentaries, and films, and the legend of the killer continues to captivate the public's imagination. The Zodiac Killer is the nickname given to an unidentified serial killer who operated in Northern California during the late 1960s and early 1970s. The killer is known for a series of murders and a series of taunting letters and ciphers sent to local newspapers and law enforcement agencies, some of which have been partially decoded. The Zodiac Killer is believed to have murdered at least 5 known victims, but he has claimed to have killed as many as 37 people. The confirmed victims include David Farade, Betty Lou Jensen, Doreen Farron, Brain Hartel, and Paul Stein. The killer's modus operandi varied, but the attacks typically involved young couples parked in remote areas, and the victims were shot, stabbed, or both. One of the most infamous aspects of the Zodiac case is the series of cryptic letters and ciphers that the killer sent to local newspapers. Some of these ciphers have been solved, but others remain uncracked. The killer has taunted law enforcement and threatened more murders in the communications. Despite extensive investigations and numerous suspects, the true identity of the Zodiac Killer has never been determined. The case remains one of the most famous unsolved mysteries in the history of American criminal investigations. Alright, now already on to Tier 2, and starting off with Henry Lee Lucas, was an American serial killer who gained notoriety in the 1980s for his confessions to numerous murders. He was born on August 23, 1936 in Blacksburg, Virginia, and died in prison on March 12, 2001. Lucas initially gained attention when he began confessing to hundreds of murders while in police custody in the early 1980s. His claims included murders across the United States, and he provided detailed accounts of his crimes. His confessions led to the closure of some unsolved cases, and he was convicted of several murders. However, it later became apparent that many of Lucas's confessions were false, and he had a history of mental illness and had a tendency to give false information to authorities. Investigations and evidence showed that he could not have committed all the murders to which he confessed. In some cases, he was able to describe crimes and scenes in great detail, but it was often discovered that the information he provided was based on details that had been made public in the media. Henry Lee Lucas's case raised significant doubts about the reliability of his confessions, and it became a prominent example of false confessions in the criminal justice system. Over time, many of his convictions were overturned, and he was ultimately convicted of 11 homicides. He died in prison while serving a life sentence, and Lucas's life and confessions have been subject of documentaries, books, and films, and his case serves as a cautionary tale about the importance of verifying confessions and evidence in criminal investigations. Snowtown Murders. The Snowtown Murders, also known as the Bodies in Barrels Murders, refers to a series of gruesome and disturbing murders that took place in South Australia in the 1990s. The name Snowtown Murders comes from the location where several of the bodies were discovered. The crimes were orchestrated by John Bunting, along with his accomplice Robert Wagner and James Velasquez, among others. Bunting had a deep-seated hatred for pedophiles and homosexuals and believed that it was his mission to get rid of society of such individuals. Under the misguided ideology, and his associates began a spree of torture, murder, and dismemberment that lasted his several years. The victims, many of whom were friends or acquaintances of Bunting and his accomplices, were lured to a house in Snowtown, South Australia, where they were subjected to horrific violence and then killed. The bodies of the victims were often dismembered, and some of the remains were placed in barrels of acid to decompose. The barrels were moved around different locations, making it difficult to trace the crimes. The crimes came to light in 1999 when police discovered one of the barrels containing human remains in a disguised bank building in Snowtown. This led to the unrevealing of the entire case, and the police eventually arrested and charged those responsible. John Bunting, Robert Wagner, and James Velasquez, and the others, were convicted of multiple counts of murders and sentenced to life in prison. The Snowtown Murders case is considered one of the most horrifying and notorious serial killer cases in Australian history. It has been subject of books, documentaries, and films, including the 2011 film Snowtown. Boston Stranglers. The Boston Strangler is the nickname given to an unidentified serial killer or killers who were active in Boston, Massachusetts area in the early 1960s. The term is most commonly associated with the murders of 13 women, although the exact number of victims remains a subject of debate. These murders occurred between 1962 and 1964 and were characterized by the victims being strangled and, in some cases, SA'd. The most well-known subject is the Boston Strangler case is Albert DeSalvo. DeSalvo was not initially identified as a subject in the murders but was arrested for other crimes and later confessed to being the Boston Strangler. He detailed confessions led to his conviction of various offenses, but his confessions to the murders were not used against him in court. Despite DeSalvo's confessions, there was significant debate and controversy over the accuracy of his claims. His modus operandi, as described in his confessions, didn't always match the known details of the crime. Additionally, some investigators and experts have questioned the validity of his confessions. The Boston Strangler case remains one of the most famous unresolved serial killer cases in American history. It is also subject of ongoing debate and speculation among criminologists, law enforcement professionals, and the public. Some continue to believe that there may have been multiple perpetrators, while others question whether DeSalvo was involved at all. Albert Fish, also known as the Gray Man or the Werewolf of Wisteria, was an American serial killer and cannibal who gained notoriety in the early 20th century. He was born on May 19, 1870 in Washington, D.C., and was executed in the electric chair at Sing Sing Prison in New York on January 16, 1936. Fish is remembered for his horrific and sadistic crimes, which included the abduction, torture, and murder of young children. His modus operandi involved luring young victims by responding to classified ads or employment notices, and he preyed primarily on young boys. After abducting his victims, he would subject them to unspeakable acts of physical and torture before ultimately killing them. Fish was apprehended in 1934 after the murder of Grace Budd, a 10-year-old girl. He had sent a letter to her family, confessing to the crime in graphic detail. The letter was traced back to him, leading to his arrest. During his trial, Fish's behavior and confessions revealed his disturbing and sadistic tendencies. He claimed to have killed and eaten several children over the years. Although the exact number remains uncertain, he was ultimately found guilty of the murder of Grace Budd and was sentenced to death. Albert Fish's case is one of the most gruesome and disturbing in the history of American serial killers. His crimes and fascination with cannibalism shocked the nation. His execution by electrocution marked his end of his reign of terror, but his legacy as one of the most depraved serial killers in history continues to haunt the public imagination. Ed Kemper, Edmund Emil Kemper III, commonly just known as Ed Kemper, is an American serial killer and one of the most notorious criminals in the history of the United States. He was born on December 18, 1948 in Burbank, California. Kemper's crimes, which occurred in the early 1970s, shocked the nation due to their extreme brutality and his ability to blend into society. Kemper's victims included 10 people, mostly young women. He had a modus operandi of picking up female hitchhikers, whom he would then murder and dismember. He was known for his intelligence and his ability to manipulate those around him, which he would then avoid suspicion and capture. Kemper's criminal career came to an end in 1973 when he murdered his mother and one of her friends. Afterward, he turned himself into the police, and during his interviews and confession, Kemper provided chillingly detailed accounts of his murders and his psychological motivations. In 1973, Ed Kemper was convicted of 8 counts of murder and was sentenced to life in prison. Despite the heinous nature of his crimes, he had been an active participant in interviews, psychological studies, and criminal profiling discussions from prison. Kemper's case has been subject of numerous different books, documentaries, and television series, including portrayals in popular crime dramas. His ability to blend into society, as well as the graphic nature of his crime, make him one of the most infamous serial killers in history. Peter Sutcliffe, known as the Yorkshire Ripper, was an English serial killer who terrorized the Yorkshire region of England in the late 1970s and early 1980s. He was born on June 2, 1946 in Bingley, West Yorkshire, England. Sutcliffe targeted women, primarily prostitutes, and murdered at least 13 of them, while also attempting to kill several more. His modus operandi typically involved bludgeoning or stabbing his victims, and he often mutilated their bodies after death. The Yorkshire Ripper case created a climate of fear and anxiety in the region as the police conducted a massive manhunt to apprehend the killer. Sutcliffe managed to elude capture for several years, and the police investigation was hampered by mistakes and misleading information. Sutcliffe was finally arrested in January 1981 when he was found in a car with a prostitute and was subsequently linked to the series of murders. He confessed to the crimes and was convicted of 13 counts of murder and 7 counts of attempted murder in 1981. He was sentenced to life in prison. In 2010, Sutcliffe was transferred to a high-security psychiatric hospital, Broadmoor, after being diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. He died in the hospital on November 2020, and the Yorkshire Ripper case is still one of the most infamous in the history of British criminal investigations. It led to significant changes in the way the police investigated and handled serial killer cases, and it had a profound impact on public perceptions of safety and crime in the region. DC Snipers, also known as the Beltway Snipers, were a pair of gunmen responsible for a series of sniper shootings in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area in October 2002. The shooters were John Allen Muhammad and Lee Boyd Malvo. Over a period of 3 weeks on October 2002, the snipers carried out a series of random and seemingly senseless shootings in the Washington, D.C. area. Their attacks resulted in 10 deaths and 3 non-fatal injuries. The victims were targeted while performing routine activities such as filling their vehicles with gas or walking in parking lots. The shootings created a climate of fear and panic in the region, and law enforcement agencies launched a massive manhunt to apprehend the snipers. The killers left messages and notes at the crime scenes and even communicated with the police, demanding ransom in exchange for stopping the attacks. Muhammad and Malvo were arrested on October 24, 2002 at the rest stop in Maryland. They were found in possession of high-powered rifles and other weapons, and ballistics evidence tied the weapon to the DC sniper attacks. Subsequent investigations revealed that the two men had embarked at a shooting spree as part of a plan to extort money and create chaos. John Allen Muhammad was sentenced to death and executed by lethal injection in Virginia in 2009, and Lee Boyd Malvo, who was a teenager at the time of the shootings, was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His sentence was later overturned, and he was resentenced in Virginia to multiple life terms. He also has expressed remorse for his involvement in the shootings, and the DC sniper case was a high-profile and frightening episode in the United States, and has a profound impact on law enforcement strategies and public perceptions of safety. Aileen Wuornos was an American serial killer who gained notoriety in the late 1980s and early 1990s. She was born on February 29, 1956 in Rochester, Michigan, and was executed by lethal injection on October 9, 2002 in Florida. Wuornos was a prostitute who became known for her crimes in Florida. She claimed to have killed 7 men between 1989 and 1990. Each of whom she alleged had SA'd her or attempted to SA her while she was working as a sex worker. Wuornos was arrested in 1991, and her case received significant media attention due to the circumstances of her crimes and her claims of self-defense. During her trial, Wuornos was found guilty of 6 of the murders and sentenced to death. Her case was the subject of extensive legal proceedings and appeals. She later recounted her claims of self-defense and admitted to the killings. She argued that she had committed the murders as a way to protect herself from being SA'd. Aileen Wuornos' life story and crimes have been the subject of books, documentaries, and films, including the 2003 film Monster, in which Charlize Theron played her. Wuornos' case is often discussed in the context of criminal justice system, issue related to mental health, and the circumstances surrounding the criminal behavior of marginalized individuals. Her execution in 2002 marked the end of the controversial and high-profile case. Ed Gein, also known as the Plainfield Ghoul or the Butcher of Plainfield, was an American serial killer and grave robber who gained notoriety for his gruesome crimes. He was born on August 27, 1906 in La Crosse County, Wisconsin, and died on July 26, 1984, in a mental hospital. Gein's crimes came to light in 1957 when police, investigating the disappearance of a local woman, discovered human remains and a variety of gruesome items in his farmhouse in Plainfield, Wisconsin. The items included human skin used for clothing, masks, and lampshades. as well as other disturbing artifacts made from body parts. It was later revealed that Kean had exhumed bodies from a local cemeteries and had also murdered 2 women, Mary Hagen and Bernice Warden. His crimes were motivated by a morbid fascination with the female body and a desire to create a woman's suit that he could wear. Ed Gein was arrested and declared mentally unfit to stand trial. He spent the rest of his life in mental institutions where he had been diagnosed with various mental disorders, and his case had been a significant impact on popular culture, inspiring books, movies, and characters in the horror genre, including Norman Bates in Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho and Leatherface in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Gein's crimes and the subsequent media coverage and fascination with his case have contributed to his status as one of the most infamous and disturbing figures in all of American crime. Fred and Rose West were a married couple from the United Kingdom who became infamous for a series of gruesome and horrific crimes committed in the 1970s and 1980s. Fred West was born on September 29, 1941, and Rosemary Rose Letts was born on November 29, 1953. They were both raised in Gloucester, England. The Wests were responsible for the abduction, SA, and the murder of at least 12 young women, including their own family members and lodgers who lived in their home. The victims were subjected to extreme and prolonged acts of violence, and the remains of those were buried in the residence garden, cellar, and nearby locations. The Wests carried out their crimes with an apparent sense of sadism and cruelty. Their crimes began to unravel in 1994 when police were called to investigate allegations of child abuse in the West household. Subsequent investigations revealed a house of horrors where multiple women had been abused and killed. Fred West was arrested, and he initially confessed to the murders but later took his own life in prison before he could stand trial. Rose West was arrested, tried, and convicted for a role in the murders of 10 of the victims. She was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, and she still remains incarcerated to this day. The case of Fred and Rose West is considered one of the most shocking and disturbing in all of British criminal history. It has been subject of books, documentaries, and media coverage, and it continues to be subject of public fascination and horror. Ivan Milat was an Australian serial killer who was responsible for a series of gruesome murders in the late 1980s and early 1990s. He was born on December 27, 1944 in Australia and died in prison on October 27, 2019. Milat's crimes are often referred to as the backpacker murders because his victims were predominantly young backpackers traveling in Australia between 1989 and 1992. Milat abducted, tortured, and murdered 7 young travelers, mostly foreign backpackers. His victims were often lured with offers of employment or transportation before being taken to remote locations in New South Wales, where they were killed. The victims' remains were discovered in a series of shallow graves in the Belongo State Forest. The case remained unsolved until 1994 when police arrested Milat's brother Richard on an unrelated charge and found weapons and other evidence linking Ivan Milat to the murders. After a long trial, he was convicted of the murders in 1996. Ivan Milat was sentenced to 7 consecutive life sentences for the murders and an additional 18 years for other offenses, including kidnapping and robbery. He maintained his innocence throughout the trial and his time in prison, but his evidence against him was substantial, including the testimony of survivors who managed to escape his clutches. Ivan Milat's crimes are among the most notorious in Australian criminal history, and the case raised concerns about the safety of travelers in Australia. H. Holmes, also known as Herman Webster Mudgett, or better known just as H. Holmes, was an American serial killer and one of the most infamous figures in the history of criminal investigations. He was born on May 16, 1861 in Gilmanton, New Hampshire, and was executed on May 7, 1896. Holmes is primarily known for his activities in Chicago during the late 19th century. Holmes constructed a building in Chicago that he referred to as his murder castle. This 3-story hotel and commercial building was designed for the labyrinth of secret passages, hidden rooms, and soundproof chambers. It allowed Holmes to carry out his gruesome crimes while evading detection. Holmes would lure victims to the hotel, often young women and travelers who had come to the Chicago World's Fair, and he would then trap and murder them in a variety of different ways, and they're kind of unique, including through the use of gas, dissection, and cremation. The exact number of his victims is uncertain, but it is believed that he has killed as many as 27 people. Holmes' crimes were discovered when authorities began investigating the disappearance of his business partner, Benjamin Pitzel, and his children. This eventually led to the discovery of his murder castle and his arrest. Holmes confessed his 27 murders, although the exact number is really debated, and he is tried for the murder of Benjamin Pitzel in 1896, and he was found guilty and sentenced to death. H. Holmes was executed by hanging on May 7, 1896. His case began the subject of extensive media coverage and fascinated the public, contributing to the emergence of the true crime genre in American journalism. His life and crimes have been the subject of books, documentaries, and films, including the best-selling book The Devil in the White City by Erik Larson. Alright, now on to Tier 3, starting with Andrei Chikatilo, known as the Butcher of Rostov or the Red Ripper, was a Soviet serial killer who operated in the Rostov Oblast region of Russia. He was born on October 16, 1936 in Ukraine, and he was executed on February 14, 1994. Chikatilo is one of the most prolific and brutal serial killers in all of modern history. Chikatilo's killing spree took place between 1978 and 1990. His victims were primarily women and children, and many of them were runaways or homeless individuals. He lured them with offers of food, money, or jobs before brutally assaulting, mutilating, and killing them. Chikatilo had a sadism disorder, and his crimes often involved horrific acts of violence. The police struggled to apprehend the killer due to the lack of evidence and his ability to blend into society. Chikatilo was arrested in 1990 following an extensive investigation, and he eventually confessed to the murders, providing detailed accounts of his crimes, and in 1992, Andrei Chikatilo was tried and found guilty of 53 murders. He was sentenced to death and executed in 1994. His case remains one of the most horrifying and notorious in the history of serial killers. The extensive media coverage and the shocking nature of his crimes have contributed to his infamy. Chikatilo's life and crimes have been the subject of books, documentaries, and films. Brady and Hindley are often referred to as the Moors murderers, were a British couple responsible for a series of heinous and notorious crimes in the 1960s. Their crimes primarily took place in the vicinity of Manchester, England, between 1963 and 1965. Brady and Hindley abducted, essayed, and murdered 5 young children and teenagers. The victims were Padine Reed, John Kilbury, Keith Bennett, Leslie Ann Downey, and Edward Evans. The bodies of the victims were buried on the Saddlesworth Moor in the Peak District National Park. The pair's crimes came to light when David Smith, a friend of Brady and Hindley, witnessed the murder of Edward Evans in their home and contacted the police. This led to their arrest in 1965. Brady was convicted of 3 of the murders, and Hindley was convicted of 2. The case of Brady and Hindley sent shockwaves through the United Kingdom. It was one of the most high-profile and disturbing criminal cases of the 20th century. The pair's lack of remorse and the horrific nature of their crimes left a lasting impact on the public consciousness. Ian Brady was sentenced to life in prison and died while incarcerated on May 15, 2017, and Myra Hindley, who also was given a life sentence, died in prison on November 15, 2002. The Moors murders remain a dark chapter in the history of British crime, and the victims' families have continued to seek the recovery of the body of Keith Bennett, who has never been found. Dennis Nilsen, also known as the Muswell Hill Murderer or the Kinley Killer, was a British serial killer who operated in London during the late 1970s and early 1980s. Nilsen was born on November 23, 1945 in Scotland, and he died in prison on May 12, 2018. Nilsen's crime came to light in 1983 when human remains were discovered in the drains of his apartment in Muswell Hill, North London. The remains were identified as those of his victims, whom he had lured to his home, strangled, and then retained for a period before disposing of the bodies. His most common crime involved picking up young men, primarily gay and homeless individuals, in London pubs and offering them shelter or alcohol before murdering them. Upon his arrest, Nilsen confessed to killing 15 young men between 1978 and 1983, although the actual number may have been much higher. He was then tried and convicted of 6 counts of murder and 2 counts of attempted murder. Dennis Nilsen was sentenced to life in prison, and he had spent the remainder of his life behind bars. His case was particularly gruesome and shocking due to the extent of the crimes and the gruesome details of the dismemberment and disposal of the victims' bodies. It remains one of the most notorious serial killer cases in British criminal history, and Nilsen's life and crimes have been the subject of books, documentaries, and dramatizations. Grim Sleeper. The Grim Sleeper is the nickname given to Lonnie David Franklin Jr., an American serial killer who operated in Los Angeles, California. Franklin was born on August 30th, 1952, and he died in prison on March 28, 2020. His crimes spanned several decades. The Grim Sleeper earned his nickname due to the long gaps between his known murders, with the first set of killings occurring in the 1980s and then a long hiatus before a series of murders in the early 2000s. His victims were primarily young African American women, many of whom were involved in S work and had struggled with substance abuse. Franklin's most common crimes involved SA and murder, and he often photographed his victims, which contributed to his eventual capture. The case remained unsolved for many years, but DNA evidence eventually linked Franklin to the crimes. In 2010, he was arrested and charged with the murders of 10 women and attempted murder of 1. In 2016, he was convicted of the murders and sentenced to death. The Grim Sleeper case was significant due to the extended period of time which the crimes occurred, and the fact that a killer remained unidentified for so long. Stephen Port, also known as the Grinder Killer, was a British serial killer who operated in London, born on February 22, 1975. He was convicted of the murders of 4 young women between 2014 and 2015. Port's victims were all young gay men whom he met through the dating app of Grindr. Port's most common crime typically involved luring his victims to his apartment in Barking, East London, where he would administer lethal doses of the drug GHB, and I'm not even going to try to pronounce it, but gamma hydrobutane, a date R-word drug. And before SAing them after their deaths, he disposed of their bodies in or near a nearby cemetery. The case remained significant media attention and raised concerns about the safety of online dating apps and the initial police presence to the death, which had been classified as non-suspicious, and so the cops really didn't think anything about it. A subsequent investigation linked the deaths and led to Port's arrest and conviction. In November 2016, Stephen Port was found guilty of the murders of 4 men: Anthony Walgate, Gabriel Cavari, Daniel Whitworth, and Jack Taylor. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Dean Corll. Dean Arnold Corll was an American serial killer and ex-offender who abducted, R-worded, tortured, and murdered a minimum of 28 teenage boys and young men between 1970 and 1973 in Houston and Pasadena, Texas. He was aided by 2 teenage accomplices, David Owen Brooks and Elmer Wayne Henley. The crimes, which became known as the Houston Mass Murders, came to light after Henley fatally shot Corll. Upon discovery, it was considered the worst example of serial murder in the United States history. Corll's victims were typically lured with an offer of a party or a lift to one of the various addresses at which he resided between 1970 and 1973. They would then be restrained either by force or by deception, and each was killed either by strangulation or shooting them with a .22 caliber pistol. Corll and his accomplices buried 17 of their victims in a rented boat shed, and 4 other victims were buried in woodland near Lake Sam Rayburn. 1 victim was buried on a beach in Jefferson County, and at least 6 victims were buried in the beach on Boulevard Peninsula. Brooks and Henley confessed to assisting Corll in several abductions and murders. Both were sentenced to life imprisonment at their subsequent trials. Corll was also known as the Candyman and the Pied Piper because he and his family had previously owned and operated a candy factory in Houston Heights, and he had been known to give free candy to local children. Gary Ridgway, also known as the Green River Killer, is an American serial killer who was responsible for a series of murders in the Seattle, Washington area during the 1980s and 1990s. Ridgway was born on February 18, 1949 in Salt Lake City, Utah. Ridgway's victims were primarily young women and girls, many of whom were S-workers or vulnerable individuals. He lured his victims, often through prostitution, and then murdered them, usually by strangulation, and then dumped their bodies in remote areas, particularly near the Green River, which gave rise to his nickname. Ridgway's killing spree went on for many years, and the police launched a massive investigation to apprehend the perpetrator. He was eventually arrested in 2001 when DNA evidence linked him to the crimes. In a plea agreement, he confessed to the killing of 71 women. That is just ridiculously just gross. 71 people, making him one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. He was convicted of 49 murders and received multiple life sentences in prison. The case of Gary Ridgway was one of the most extensive and high-profile serial killers investigations in the world. It had a significant impact on law enforcement techniques and the use of DNA evidence in criminal investigation. Ridgeway's cooperation and confessions led to the closure of many cold cases, providing some relief to the victims' families. Richard Chase, also known as the Vampire of Sacramento, was an American serial killer who operated in California during the late 1970s. He was born on May 23, 1950, in Santa Clara, California, and his crimes are characterized by extreme violence and bizarre behaviors. Chase's crimes began in 1977 when he committed a series of gruesome murders in the Sacramento area. His victims included men, women, and children, and Chase's most common crime often involved breaking into homes and killing both individuals and animals. He engaged in acts of cannibalism and necrophilia, as well as drinking the blood of his victims, which earned him as the vampire moniker. The brutality and erratic behavior of Chase created a climate of fear in the Sacramento community. He was arrested in 1977 after a bloody and disturbing crime spree that left several people dead. He was found guilty of multiple counts of murder and other charges, and in 1980, Richard Chase was convicted of 6 counts of first-degree murder and was sentenced to death. However, he died by S-word in his prison cell on December 26, 1980, before his execution could even take place. The case of Richard Chase remains one of the most chilling and horrific in the history of American serial killers. His disturbing behaviors and mental illness contributed to his notoriety, and the case has been subject to numerous books, documentaries, and media coverage. The Hillside Stranglers were a pair of American serial killers who operated in California during the late 1970s. The two main perpetrators were Kenneth Bonazzi and Angelo Bonuno, who were cousins. Their crimes were characterized by the abduction, torture, SA, and murder of several young women. The Hillside Stranglers targeted their victims in the Los Angeles area, particularly in the hills and neighborhoods surrounding the city. They lured women and girls into their vehicle, SA'd them, and tortured them, and then killed them before dumping their bodies in various different locations. The case of the Hillside Stranglers came to the attention of law enforcement in 1977, and the two killers were eventually arrested and charged with multiple counts of murders and other crimes. Their arrest was made possible by tips from the community as well as their own reckless behavior. Kenneth Bonazzi, in his attempt to avoid the death penalty, cooperated with law enforcement and provided information about the crimes. Angelo Bonuno went to trial and was found guilty of multiple counts of murder, and he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Kenneth Bonazzi was sentenced to life in prison for his role in the murders and is currently incarcerated in Washington state. The case of the Hillside Stranglers is one of the most infamous in the annals of American serial killers and has been subject to books, documentaries, and various media coverage. Carl Panzram was a notorious American serial killer and arsonist who operated during the early 20th century. He was born on June 28, 1891 in East Grand Forks, Minnesota, and died by execution in 1930. Panzram's criminal career was marked by an extreme violence and hatred towards society. Throughout his life, Panzram committed a series of brutal crimes, including multiple murders, SAs, and arson. He targeted men, women, and children. So this guy's just, I mean, they're all horrible, but this guy, men, women, and children, like how messed up can you be? But he often lured his victims under the pretense of robbery before carrying out his violent acts. Panzram's criminal history included several stints in prison, where he often assaulted both inmates and prison staff. Panzram's crimes took him across the United States, and he showed no remorse for his actions. In his own writings, he claimed to have murdered at least 22 people and SA'd over 1,000 men and boys. 1,000 people he SA'd. And Carl Panzram was eventually arrested in 1928 and sent to Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary, where he continued his violent behavior. While in prison, he murdered a prison employee. Panzram was subsequently sentenced to death, and he was executed by hanging on September 5, 1930, at Leavenworth. The Axman of New Orleans is the nickname given to an unidentified serial killer who operated in New Orleans, Louisiana, during a period of intense activity in 1918 and 1919. The killer is known for his distinctive choice of weapon, often attacking his victims with an axe or other sharp instruments, which left gruesome and brutal crime scenes. The identity of the Axeman remains a mystery to this day, as he was never caught or positively identified. He targeted both men and women, often attacking couples while they slept in their homes. Some of his victims survived the attacks, providing descriptions of a dark figure wearing a hat and overcoat. One of the peculiar aspects of this case was a letter, allegedly written by the killer and sent to the local newspaper in March 1919. In the letter, the author claimed to be the supernatural being and threatened to kill again, but stated that he would spare anyone who was listening to jazz music at the time of his attacks. This bizarre letter contributed to the legend of the Axeman. The crimes eventually subsided, and the killer was never apprehended or identified. In the case of the Axman of New Orleans remains unsolved, and one of the most enduring mysteries in American criminal history. Alright, now on to Tier 4, starting off with Clifford Olen, also known as the Beast of British Columbia, was a Canadian serial killer who committed a series of heinous crimes in the early 1980s. He was born on January 1st, 1940 in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. Between 1980 and 1981, Olen murdered at least 11 children and teenagers in British Columbia. His victims were predominantly girls and boys aged 9 to 18. Olsen's modus operandi often involved luring his victims with the promise of a job or money, SAing them, and then brutally killing them. Afterward, he would then dispose of their bodies in various different locations, and the crime sent shockwaves through Canada and prompted a massive manhunt to apprehend the perpetrator. In 1981, Clifford Olen was arrested and charged with the murders, which he confessed to in detail. His actions and lack of remorse horrified the nation. Olen was convicted of 11 counts of first-degree murder and received 11 concurrent life sentences in prison. In the years following his imprisonment, he continued to taunt the victims' families and authorities with various actions, including to attempt to profit from his notoriety, and Clifford Olen died in prison on September 30th, 2011, at the age of 71. His case remains one of the most infamous and disturbing in all of Canadian criminal history. Leonard Lake was an American serial killer who, along with his accomplice Charles N.G., committed a series of horrific crimes in California during the 1980s. Leonard Lake was born on October 29, 1945 in San Francisco, California, and he died by S-word in prison on June 6, 1985. Lake and NG were responsible for the abduction, torture, SA, and murder of multiple individuals, primarily women and children. They lured their victims to a remote cabin in Calaveras County, California, where they subjected them to unspeakable violence before killing them. Some of their crimes were captured on videotapes, adding an additional layer of horror to their acts. The case came to light in 1985 when Lake was arrested on weapon charges and subsequently died by S-word in custody after ingesting cyanide pills. This led to the discovery of the cabin and evidence of their crimes, including the videotapes, and Charles N.G. managed to flee the area but was later captured and brought to trial. He was found guilty of multiple counts of murder and was sentenced to death. N.G.'s trial was one of the most costly and lengthy in all of California history, and he still remains on death row to this day. Gilbert Paul Jordan, often referred to as the Boozing Barber, was a Canadian serial killer and a S-predator who operated in Vancouver, British Columbia during the late 20th century. Jordan was born on November 12, 1931, and he died on July 7, 2006. Jordan's crimes primarily involved the abuse of alcohol and exploitation of women, often indigenous women. He was known for buying alcoholic drinks for vulnerable women, leading to an inebriation and then engaging in S acts. Tragically, some of these women died from alcohol poisoning while in his company. Although Jordan's actions led to the deaths of multiple women, he was not initially convicted of murder, but faced charges related to unlawful S acts and contributing to the delinquency of minors. In some cases, the cause of death was attributed to alcohol poisoning rather than a homicide. The case of Gilbert Paul Jordan raised concerns about the treatment of indigenous women and the justice system's response to crimes against vulnerable populations. Jordan's actions and the tragic deaths of the women who were in his company highlighted the need for greater protection and support for marginalized individuals. Jordan himself was found dead in the prison cell on July 7, 2006. Robert Willie Pikon is a Canadian serial killer who is responsible for a series of gruesome murders in British Columbia, Canada, during the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Born on October 24, 1949 in British Columbia, Pikon's crimes came to light in the early 2000s. Pikon was a pig farmer in Canada, and he targeted S-workers, primarily from Vancouver's downside east side. He lured these vulnerable women to his farms, where he subjected them to SA, torture, and then murder. Afterward, he disposed of their remains by feeding them to his pigs, incarcerating them, or burying them on his property. The investigation into Pikton's crimes began in 2002, following a tip to the police. A search to his property led to the discovery of human remains and belongings of missing women. In 2007, Pikton was convicted of 6 counts of second-degree murder and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for 25 years. Pikton was charged with 26 counts of first-degree murder, but these charges were stayed, meaning that they were not pursued in court. After his initial convictions, it was believed that Pikton may have been responsible for the deaths of more women, but these additional charges were not pursued due to the complexity of the case. The case of Robert Pikton is still one of the most notorious and disturbing in Canadian criminal history. Wayne Williams is an American serial killer who was convicted of 2 murders in Atlanta, Georgia during the late 1970s and early 1980s. Williams was born on May 27, 1958 in Atlanta. His case is notable for his broader circumstances surrounding the Atlanta child murders, a series of murders of primarily African American children and young adults that occurred in Atlanta between 1979 and 1981. The Atlanta child murders involved the deaths of at least 29 individuals, most of them children and teenagers who were predominantly black. The case created widespread fear and outrage within the African American community and garnered national attention. Wayne Williams became a suspect in the murders after he was arrested in 1981 for the murder of 2 adult men, Nathaniel Carter and Jimmy Rain Payne. This prosecution argued that the deaths of these 2 men were part of the larger pattern of murders in Atlanta. Williams was found guilty on the murders of Carter and Payne in 1982 and sentenced to life in prison. He was consistently maintained his innocence regarding the other unsolved murders, including those of the children. Many aspects of the Atlanta child murders case remain controversial, and there had been ongoing debates and investigations regarding whether Williams was responsible for any of the other deaths, but we don't really know to this day. In the case of Wayne Williams and the Atlanta child murders remains a subject of intense discussion and controversy, with some believing that he was a scapegoat and others convinced of his involvement in additional killings. The case also spurred important conversations about racism, bias, and criminal justice procedures. Herbert Mullen is an American serial killer who operated in California during the early 1970s. Born on April 18, 1947 in Salinas, California, Mullen's crimes were driven by a combination of mental illness and a fixation on what he believes to be the greater good. Mullen's killing spree began in 1972 and continued for several years. He believed that his murders could prevent earthquakes and other natural disasters by sacrificing people to the greater good. He targeted both strangers and acquaintances, and his methods of murder varied, including shooting, stabbing, and bludgeoning. Mullen's crimes further spread fear and confusion in the Santa Cruz area, and he was not apprehended until 1973, following a tip from a friend who had become concerned about his behavior. In 1973, Herbert Mullen was convicted of multiple counts of murder and sentenced to life in prison. He remains incarcerated in California to this day, and Mullen's case is one of the many examples of individuals who commit heinous acts due to a combination of mental illness and disturbing delusions. Paul Bernardo is a Canadian serial killer who, along with his then-wife Karla Homolka, committed a series of heinous crimes in the early 1990s. Born on August 27, 1964, in Ontario, Canada, Bernardo's crimes shocked the nation and are among the most notorious in all of Canadian history. Bernardo and Homolka were responsible for the abduction, R-word, and murder of several young women, including Leslie Mahaffey and Christian French, both of whom were teenagers. Their crimes often included the SA and drugging of Homolka's own sister, Tammy Homolka, which resulted in her accidental death. The case came to light in 1993 when Homolka was arrested and subsequently provided evidence against Bernardo. He was then arrested soon after. During the trial, the public learned of the extent of the brutality of their crimes, and the case received widespread media attention in Canada and beyond. In 1995, Paul Bernardo was convicted of multiple counts of murder, SA, and other charges. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, and Karla Homolka, who struck a controversial plea deal and testified against Bernardo, served a reduced sentence and was released from prison in 2005. The case of Paul Bernardo and his wife remains one of the most infamous and disturbing in Canadian criminal history and has a profound impact on Canadian legal system, and particularly regarding plea bargains and sentencing. Alright, now on to Tier 5, starting with Samuel Little, also known as Samuel McDowell, was an American serial killer who was active during the late 20th century. He was born on June 7, 1940, in Reynolds, Georgia. Little was really known about his extensive criminal history and the commission of multiple murders, and Little was arrested and convicted of various crimes over the years, including robbery, assault, and R-word. However, it is not until 2012 that he was linked to a series of murders of women, often marginalized and vulnerable, primarily in the 1970s through the early 2000s. In 2014, Samuel Little was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder in California for the murders of 3 women. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, and it was actually during his time in prison that he began to confess to numerous additional murders. He claimed to have killed as many as 93 people across the United States, making him one of the most prolific serial killers in U.S. history. He provided detailed descriptions of the victims and the circumstances of their deaths. Law enforcement agencies across the country began investigating his claims, as many of his confessions were found to be credible. DNA evidence and other factors supported his statements, leading to his connection to a significant number of unsolved cases. Samuel Little died on December 30th, 2020 in a California prison, and his case has raised concerns about the investigation of serial killers and the handling of cold cases, as well as the importance of giving victims' families closure. Rodney Alcala, also known as the Dating Game Killer, was an American serial killer and convicted R-word who operated in California during the 1970s. Born on August 23, 1943 in San Antonio, Texas, Alcala was known for his charismatic and charming demeanor, which he used to gain the trust of his victims. Alcala's victims included the abduction, R-word, and murder of several women and girls, with victims ranging in age from 12 to 31. He was known to use his appearance and charm to lure young women and sometimes pose as a professional photographer to entice his victims into a photo shoot before assaulting and killing them. Alcala's criminal history and activities raised concerns and suspicions, and he was arrested multiple times for various different offenses, including R-word and assault. However, he managed to evade conviction for many years due to his intelligence and manipulation. In 1979, Rodney Alcala was finally arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder. He was convicted of 5 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death in 1980. However, his convictions were overturned on appeal, leading to a retrial. In 2010, Rodney Alcala was convicted for a second time, this time for the murders of 5 women in California, and he was sentenced to death again. He died on July 24, 2021, while on death row in California. Alcala's case remains one of the most infamous in all of American serial killers, and it raised questions on how the criminal justice system handles serial predators. The Cleveland torso murderer, also known as the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run, was an unidentified serial killer who operated in the Cleveland, Ohio area during the 1930s. The killer was known for decapitating and dismembering the bodies of his victims, hence the name torso murderer. The killer's victims were often marginalized individuals, including drifters and alcoholics, and the crimes took place in the section of Cleveland known as Kingsbury Run, which was inhabited by a transient population. The murders involved a gruesome pattern of beheadings and dismemberment, making it difficult for law enforcement to identify and apprehend the perpetrator. Despite the efforts of law enforcement, the Cleveland torso murder was never captured or definitively identified. The case remains one of the most enduring mysteries in all of American criminal history, and various suspects were considered, but the killer's true identity was never established. Bell Gunnis was a Norwegian-American serial killer who operated in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Born in Brindal, Paulsdatter, Storsjøs on November 11, 1859, in Selbu, Norway, she later immigrated to the United States. She is often referred to as one of the most prolific female serial killers in American history. Bell Gunnis is believed to have killed numerous men, women, and children, including her own children, over a span of several years. Her primary motive appeared to be a financial gain through life insurance claims and the theft of the victim's assets. Her gruesome crimes came to light in 1908 after her farm in Laporte, India, burned down. Authorities discovered several bodies buried on the property, and Bell Gunnis was reported missing and presumed dead in the fire, but her remains were never conclusively identified. The exact number of her victims remains uncertain and unknown, but it is believed to have been as many as 40 people. The case of Bell Gunnis continues to be subject of fascination and speculation. Gary Heidnik was an American serial killer and R-word who operated in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania during the late 1980s. Born on November 22, 1943 in Cleveland, Ohio, Heidnick's crimes were characterized by extreme cruelty and violence. Heidnick abducted, R-worded, and imprisoned multiple women in his basement in Philadelphia. He subjected his victims to horrific abuse, including torture and starvation. He kept them in a pit he had dug underneath his home, and had at least 2 of his victims died as a result of his actions. In 1987, Heidnick's crimes came to light when one of his captives, Joseva Rivera, managed to escape and notify the police. This led to the discovery of other victims and the arrest of Heidnick. In 1988, Gary Heidnick was tried, convicted, and sentenced to death for the murders and other crimes. He was executed by lethal injection in Pennsylvania on July 6, 1999. The case of Gary Heidnick remains one of the most disturbing and shocking in the history of American serial killers. His crimes, the conditions in which he kept his victims, and his trial and execution continue to be subjects of interest and discussion in the realm of true crime. Eric Edgar Cooke, also known as the Night Caller, was an Australian serial killer who operated in Perth, Western Australia during the late 1960s. Born on February 25, 1931 in Victoria Park, Perth, Cooke's victims were characterized by extreme violence and a variety of methods. Cooke's crimes included a series of violent burglaries, R-word, and murders. He used various different weapons, including knives, to commit his crimes. Cooke primarily targeted women, but his victims also included men and children. His reign of terror and the police's failure to apprehend him created fear and panic in Perth during the early 1960s. Cooke and his final capture in 1963 and later confessed to a series of brutal crimes. In 1964, Eric Edgar Cooke was tried, convicted, and sentenced to death for the murders. He was executed by hanging in Perth on October 26, 1964. The case of Eric Cooke is one of the most notorious in Australian criminal history. Richard Kuklinski, also known as the Iceman, was an American contract serial killer and just killer who operated during the 1960s through the 1980s. Born on April 11, 1935 in Jersey City, New Jersey, Kuklinski was involved in organized crime and carried out a series of violent crimes, including murders for hire. Kuklinski was a ruthless and cold-blooded killer known for his brutality. He used various methods to carry out his murders, including firearms, poison, and other means. He was involved in the contract killings of various criminal organizations, which paid him to eliminate their rivals and enemies. Kuklinski's criminal activities went undetected for many years, as he was skilled at covering his tracks and avoiding law enforcement. He earned the nickname the Iceman because of his method of freezing the bodies of some of his victims to disguise the time of death and confuse investigators. In 1986, Richard Kuklinski was arrested and eventually convicted of multiple counts of murder, as well as other crimes, including drug trafficking. He was sentenced to multiple life sentences in prison, and Kuklinski died in prison on March 5, 2006. His life and crimes have been the subject of books, documentaries, and films, and his case remains one of the most chilling in the annals of American organized crime and serial killers. Arthur Shawcross, also known as the Genesee River Killer and the Rochester Strangler, was an American serial killer who operated in upstate New York during the 1980s. He was born on June 6, 1945 in Kittery, Maine. Shawcross's crimes involved the brutal murders of both women and children, and his victims were often strangled, mutilated, and subjected to SA. His criminal activities spanned several years and included a killing spree in Rochester, New York during the late 1990s. Shawcross had a history of criminal behavior and had been incarcerated for manslaughter of his 2 children in 1970s. After serving 15 years in prison, he was released on parole, and his crimes as a serial killer began soon afterward. In 1990, Shawcross was arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder. He was convicted of 11 counts of murder and received a lengthy prison sentence. He was serving his sentence at the Sullivan Correctional Facility in New York when he died on November 10, 2008 due to a heart attack. The case of Arthur Shawcross is one of the most notorious in New York history. Joseph DeAngelo, also known as the Golden State Killer in the East Area R-Word, is an American serial killer, R-Word, and burglar who committed a series of brutal crimes in California during the 1970s and 1980s. Born on November 8, in Bath, New York, and D'Angelo's crimes spread fear throughout California and remained unsolved for decades. D'Angelo's criminal activities included at least 13 murders, over 50 SAs, and numerous burglaries. He operated in various regions of California, including Sacramento, the San Francisco Bay Area, and Southern California. His methods included breaking into homes, restraining and terrorizing his victims, and subjecting them to SA and murder. Despite a massive investigation and numerous attempts to apprehend the suspect, D'Angelo managed to evade capture for many years. It was only in 2018 that he was arrested and identified through a series of use of advanced DNA analysis and genealogy techniques. And his arrest was a significant breakthrough in one of the most infamous cold pit cases in American history. In June 2020, Joseph D'Angelo pleaded guilty to multiple charges, including murder, and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His capture and prosecution marked a significant moment in the field of criminal investigation, as DNA technology and genealogy databases were instrumental in identifying and apprehending this elusive serial killer. David Parker Ray was an American serial killer and torturer who operated in New Mexico in the 1990s. He was born on November 6, 1939, and died on May 28, 2002, while in custody. Ray's crimes were particularly heinous, and he is often referred to as the Toy Box Killer because of the soundproofed trailer he used as a torture chamber, which he referred to as his toy box. Ray's crimes came to light in 1999 when one of his victims, Cynthia Vigil, managed to escape from his captivity. She was found naked and chained, with a dog collar around her neck, by a passerby who contacted the authorities. Vigil's testimony led to the arrest and investigation of David Parker Ray. Inside the trailer, and the authorities found a horrifying array of tools and devices designed for torture and sexual sadism. Ray had recorded his own voice explaining the rules and procedures to his victims, and this recording was played during his trial. He and his girlfriend, Cindy Hendy, were both arrested and charged with multiple counts of kidnapping, SA, and murder. David Parker Ray was convicted on multiple charges and sentenced to 224 years in prison without the possibility of parole. He later died in prison in 2002 following a heart attack. Ray's case is still one of the most disturbing and notorious in the history of American serial killers, and due to the sadistic nature of his crimes and the extent of evidence found in his toy box. Alright, now on to Tier 6, starting with Peter Kürten, also known as the Vampire of Dusseldorf, was a German serial killer and R-word who terrorized the city of Dusseldorf, and I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that. I know I have a lot of mispronouncing errors in my videos, but I don't speak German, so yeah, sorry. In the surrounding areas during the early 20th century. He was born on May 26, 1883, and was executed by beheading of July 2, 1931. Kürten's criminal activities spanned from 1913 to 1929. He committed a series of gruesome and brutal crimes, including SA, mutilations, and murders. His victims included men, women, and children, and he often engaged in acts of SV and necrophilia. Kürten's choice of weapons varied, including knives, hammers, and other objects. Kürten's nickname, the Vampire of Dusseldorf, stemmed from his admission that he had occasionally drank the blood of his victims and had a fascination with the act. He confessed to multiple murders, and his trial in 1931 attracted significant media attention. Kürten was found guilty of 9 murders and 7 attempted murders. Although he claimed to responsibility for more than 60 offenses, he was sentenced to death and executed by guillotine. His case remains one of the most infamous and disturbing in the annals of criminal history due to the sadistic and gruesome nature of his crimes. Kürten's life and crimes have been the subject of numerous books, documentaries, and films, and is often studied in the context of criminal psychology and criminology. Jack Unterweger was an Austrian serial killer and writer who gained notoriety for his gruesome crimes and the unusual circumstances surrounding his life. He was born on August 16, 1950 in Austria and died by S-word in prison on June 29, 1994. Unterweger's criminal history included convictions for murder and other crimes. He was initially imprisoned for a murder in the 1970s, and while in prison he began writing and gained attention for his literary talents. His work has been the symbol of rehabilitation, and he was actually released from prison in 1990. However, after his release, Unterweger embarked on a new killing spree, targeting and strangling sex workers in Austria, the Czech Republic, and the United States. His crimes were marked by extreme violence and sexual sadism. Unterweger's reign of terror came to an end in 1992 when he was arrested in Miami, Florida for a probation violation. He was subsequently extradited to Austria, where he stood trial for multiple murders, and in 1994 he was found guilty of 11 murders and he was sentenced to life in prison. Pee Wee Gaskins, whose real name is Donald Henry Gaskins, was an American serial killer who terrorized South Carolina during the 1970s. He was born on March 13, 1933, and he was executed in the electric chair on September 6, 1991. Gaskins had a troubled and violent upbringing, and he was involved in the criminal activities from a young age. His criminal history included theft, assault, and R-word, and he was eventually convicted of murder in 1976. Gaskins confessed to killing several individuals, and he claimed to have killed more than 100 people, earning him the name of the meanest man in America. And his victims were often people he knew, and he used various methods including strangulation, shooting, and poisoning to carry out his murders. He was known for his small stature, which led to his name Pee-wee, and Gaskins was not only a prolific killer, but also a notorious prison inmate. While in prison, he killed another inmate in an attempt to escape multiple times. In 1982, Gaskins was sentenced to death for a murder of a fellow inmate, and he later confessed to several of his other murders and provided details about his crimes. In 1991, he was executed in the electric chair. Donald Pee Wee Gaskins' life and crimes continue to be the subject of interest and study in the field of criminology due to the brutality and the large number of victims, though the exact number of his victims remains unclear. In his autobiography, Final Truth provides disturbing insights into his life and mindset. Mikhail Popov, also known as the Werewolf and the Argus Maniac, is a Russian serial killer who was active between 1994 and 2012. He was a former police officer in the Siberian city of Angorsk, Russia. Popov also convicted of murdering at least 78 people, primarily women, although he claimed to have killed more than 80 individuals. Popkov's modus operandi involved picking up his victims, often prostitutes or women he encountered while on patrol, in his police car, and then he would take them to remote locations, SA them, and then brutally murder them. His nickname, the Werewolf, was derived from his method of killing, which is particularly vicious and brutal. In 2015, Popkov was arrested and subsequently confessed to his murders. He was sentenced to life in prison in 2015, and in 2018, he tried and convicted in a second trial for an additional 56 murders, bringing the total number of his known victims to 78. He was sentenced to a second life term in prison without the possibility of parole, and Mikhail Popkov's case is one of the most chilling and notorious serial killer cases in all of Russian history. His actions shocked the nation, and his conviction highlighted the importance of thorough investigations and holding law enforcement officers accountable for their crimes. William Bonin, also known as the Freeway Killer, was an American serial killer who was active in Southern California during the late 1970s and early 1980s. He was convicted of a series of abductions, SAs, and murders, primarily targeting adolescent boys. Bonin's modus operandi involved luring young male hitchhikers into his van, where he would then SA them and torture them before ultimately murdering them. He often dumped the bodies along freeways, hence his nickname, the Freeway Killer. His crimes terrorized the Los Angeles area, and law enforcement agencies across Southern California conducted a joint task force to apprehend him. In 1982, William Bonin was arrested and subsequently convicted of 14 counts of first-degree murder, making him one of the most prolific serial killers in California's history at the time. He was sentenced to death. His accomplice, Vernon Butts, also received a lengthy prison sentence for his role in the murders. The Doodler is the nickname given to an unidentified serial killer and assailant who operated in San Francisco, California in the mid-1970s. The moniker, the Doodler, stems from the killer's apparent habit of sketching or drawing his potential victims before attacking them. The Doodler is believed to have targeted gay men. His modus operandi typically involved approaching his victims in San Francisco gay bars, striking up conversations, and then drawing sketches or doodles on a notepad. After his initial interaction, he would then leave with the victim and, in some cases, engage in SA before committing acts of violence. He is believed to have killed at least 5 individuals and seriously wounded several others. The exact number of victims could be much higher, but the Doodler's true identity was never determined. Law enforcement agencies investigated the case, but it was really challenging to make progress due to the social stigma surrounding homosexuality at the time. Some of the victims survived but did not cooperate with the police, which hindered the investigation. Consequently, the doodler was never captured or identified, and the case remains unsolved. The case of the doodler remains one of San Francisco's unsolved serial killer mysteries from the 1970s. There have been periodic attempts to rekindle the investigation and solicit information from the public in hopes of identifying the killer. Alright, now into tier 7, second to last tier, and you're already this far into the video, so consider subscribing and liking, and if you don't want to subscribe and like, then don't. Then leave some comment and feedback. But anyways, now starting off with Herb Baumeister, was an American serial killer who was active in the 1990s. He is known for his connection to the I-70 Strangler case. Baumeister operated in the Indianapolis, Indiana area and was responsible for the murders of several men, many of whom were gay and frequented gay bars. His victims were known to have been strangled to death. Baumeister's killing spree came to light when human remains were discovered on his property in Westfield, Indiana. The investigation into the gruesome findings eventually led him to become a suspect in the murders. Baumeister's connection to the killings became more apparent, and personal belongings of some of the victims were found at his home. Before he could be arrested, Baumeister fled and committed S-word in Canada in 1996. This prevented him from facing charges or standing trial for the murders. The exact number of victims attributed to him is not known with certainty, as there have been multiple victims and there's been many conspiracies on how many there is, but no one's really sure. And some law enforcement agencies suspect he could be responsible for more unsolved cases. Baumeister's case remains a chilling and unresolved one, and it raised questions about the way law enforcement agencies handle missing person casings and the serial killer investigations. Karl Denke, also known as Papa Denke or the Forgotten Cannibal, was a German serial killer who operated in the early 20th century. He is notorious for his gruesome crimes, which involved the murder and cannibalization of several individuals. Denke lived in the town of Münsterberg, which is now in Poland but was then part of Germany. He operated a small inn where he preyed upon travelers and vagrants between 1903 and 1924. He is believed to have murdered and dismembered at least 42 people, mostly men who were lured to his inn under various pretenses. His gruesome activities went undetected for many years, partly because of his transient nature of his victims and the fact that he often cooked and ate their remains or fed them to his pig. So this guy's messed up. But yeah, of course, everyone in this Iceberg is messed up, but I mean, he ate them. And Denke was eventually apprehended in 1924 when police discovered human remains on his property. After his arrest, he was found dead in his jail cell, having committed S-word. Karl Denke's case is a disturbing and shocking example of a serial killer who operated with a level of brutality and cunning that allowed him to evade capture for an extended period. His crimes remain a chilling chapter in the history of German serial killers. Todd Kohlhepp is an American serial killer and S-offender who gained notoriety for a series of murders he committed in South Carolina. His crimes came to light in 2016 when a woman named Koala Brown was found chained inside a storage container on Kohlhepp's property. Kohlhepp's known crimes include the Superbike murders. In 2003, Kohlhepp murdered 4 people at a motorcycle shop in Genesee, South Carolina. The victims were Scott Ponder, Beverly Guy, Brian Lucas, and Chris Sherbert. Kohlhepp was not apprehended for these murders until many years later, and his second one was kidnapping murders. In August 2016, Koala Brown and her boyfriend, Charles Carver, went missing. They were later found on Kohlhepp's property, with Brown chained inside a storage container. Sadly, Charles Carver was found dead on the property, and Kohlhepp admitted to shooting him. Koala Brown was rescued, and the other victims. Kohlhepp has claimed to have killed additional people, but the exact number is not confirmed. He had stated that there have been many more victims, but this information has not been independently verified. Todd Kohlhepp was arrested and subsequently convicted for his crimes. In May 2017, he pleaded guilty to the Superbike murders and the kidnapping of Koala Brown, and the murders of Charles Carver, Johnny, and Megan Coxey, a couple who had disappeared in 2015, and 3 other victims. He was sentenced to 7 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, and Kohlhepp's case is a chilling example of a serial killer who operated under the radar for years before being brought to justice. Alexander P., often referred to as the chessboard killer, is a Russian serial killer who operated in Moscow between 1992 and 2006. Pushkin is known for committing a series of brutal murders, targeting both men and women. Pushkin's modus operandi involved luring his victims, many of whom were homeless or vulnerable individuals, into Moscow's Bista Park. He would befriend them, offer them by offering them alcohol, and then attack and kill them with a blunt object such as a hammer. He frequently inserted bottles or sticks into the victims' skulls after the murders, a gruesome act that led to the nickname the chessboard killer. Pushkin was convicted of 48 murders, although he initially claimed to have killed 63, which would have made him one of the most prolific serial killers in Russian history, and during his trial, he stated that he aimed to murder 64 individuals to fill all squares on a chessboard, a goal he did not achieve. In October 2007, Pushkin was found guilty of 48 murders and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, and his case drew widespread attention and raised concerns about the mental health of serial killers and their motivations. Dang, this is going to be hard to pronounce. I'm not even going to try it, but I'll just call them the Maniacs, also known as the Hammer Maniacs, were a group of Ukrainian serial killers who carried out a series of extremely brutal and disturbing murders in the city of Dnipropetrovsk, now Dnipro, in Ukraine during the summer of 2007. The group consisted of Viktor Saviganov and Igor, both in the late teens at the time. The crimes committed at the Maniacs were particularly gruesome and shocked the nation and the world. They recorded some of their crimes on video, and these recordings were later leaked on the internet. The videos showed the killers brutally attacking and killing homeless people, pedestrians, and random individuals with hammers and other blunt objects. The level of violence depicted in the videos were deeply disturbing and horrifying. Over the course of a few weeks in 2007, the Maniacs murdered at least 21 people, and their victims included people of different ages and backgrounds with really no consistent motive. The authorities arrested both of them in July 2007, and both were tried and found guilty of their crimes. In February 2007, Viktor and Igor were convicted of multiple counts of murder, and they were both sentenced to life in prison. The case of these maniacs remains one of the most chilling and disturbing examples of serial killers who acted with extreme cruelty, and it had a profound impact on Ukraine and beyond. Juan Corona is a Mexican-American serial killer who was convicted of one of the most significant multiple murders in United States history. His crimes took place in California in the early 1970s. Corona, a labor contractor who hired migrant workers, was convicted of murdering 25 men in the Yuba City area of California's Sutter County in 1971. The victims were all migrant workers, and many of them were originally from Mexico. Corona was also known to have employed these men, and he lured them to remote locations before killing them. He buried their bodies in shallow graves in orchards and had access to. Corona's crimes came to light when one of the bodies were discovered in 1971. He was arrested and later convicted of the murders in 1973, and he was sentenced to 25 concurrent life sentences in prison, one for each of his known victims. Juan Corona's case remains one of the most notorious multiple murder cases in United States history, and it highlighted the vulnerability of migrant workers and the importance of effective law enforcement in protecting marginalized and transient communities. Luis Garavido, known as the La Bestia, or the Beast, or Tribilin, in the Colombian serial killer and child R-word. So this guy's, these guys, as I've said multiple times, all these guys are bad, but this guy's a child R-word. And if you know R-word, this guy's just, bad. He is one of the most prolific serial killers in the world, known for his extreme brutality and the large number of child victims he claimed between 1992 and 1999. Garavido was responsible for the abduction, R-word, torture, and murder of an estimated 138 boys. Although the actual number of victims could be much higher, his victims were often impoverished street children who were vulnerable and easy prey. Garavido would lure them with offers of money, gifts, or work, and then subjected them to horrific abuse. In 1999, Garavido was captured and later convicted of multiple counts of murder and SA in exchange for his cooperation with authorities in leading them to the locations of some of his victims' bodies. He received a reduced sentence, which I don't know why he's allowed to have one, but instead of life imprisonment, he was sentenced to, a casual 1,853 years and 9 days in prison. So, Yeah, that's a lot of years, and he deserves it. The maximum sentence allowed under Colombian law. Due to the Colombian law's 40-year maximum sentence, his actual time in prison would be considerably shorter. Garavito's case drew international attention and raised concerns about the vulnerability of marginalized children and the need for improved child protection in criminal justice systems. His crimes are among the most heinous and shocking in all of criminal history. Alright, now onto the final tier of the serial killer iceberg. Tier 8, and these will be, technically, the most disturbing serial killers and cases of history. And so let's get into it. Benjamin Atkins, often referred to as the Woodward Corridor Killer, was an American serial killer who operated in Detroit, Michigan area during the early 1990s. He targeted women and is known for a series of brutal murders and SAs. Atkins began his killing spree in 1991. His victims were primarily women who were R-worded and strangled, and victims were often involved in S-work or struggled with addiction, which made them even more vulnerable. Atkins' modus operandi was to brutally strangle his victims and then sometimes engage in necrophilia. He was arrested in 1992 and eventually convicted of 11 murders. Although he claimed to have killed more in exchange for leading investigators to the bodies of some of the victims, he received a plea deal that spread from the death penalty. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, and Atkins' case is one of the many examples of serial killers who targeted marginalized and vulnerable individuals. Tsutomu Miyazaki, and I'm sorry if I mispronounced that, but Tsutomu Miyazaki, often referred to as a Tokyo Murderer or the Little Miss Murder, was a Japanese serial killer and cannibal who committed a series of gruesome crimes in the late 1980s and early 1990s. His crimes were young girls, primarily between the ages of 4 and 7, and he committed acts of SA, murder, and necrophilia. Miyazaki, who was born in 1962, had a troubled childhood and exhibited signs of mental illness from a young age. He was arrested in 1989 after he was caught attempting to kidnap a young girl. During his arrest, evidence of his previous crimes were discovered in his home, including photographs and videos of his victims, as well as the remains of one of the girls. In 1990, Tsutomu Miyazaki was convicted of multiple murders and SA and other crimes. He was sentenced to death, and his trial and details of his crimes caused shock and outrage in Japan. His case contributed to a nationwide debate about the mental health care, the justice system, and the influence of violent media on young individuals. Miyazaki was executed in 2008, becoming one of the first individuals to be hanged in Japan after a 40-month unofficial moratorium on executions. His crimes remain deeply disturbing and have left a lasting impact on Japanese society. Ervil LeBaron was an American polygamist and the leader of a violent and extremist sect within the larger LeBaron family of Mormons. He is best known for his role in orchestrating a series of murders, primarily targeting rival polygamous groups between the late 1970s and early 1980s. LeBaron's group, known as the Church of the Lamb of the God, was involved in a power struggle over leadership and religious doctrine with other Mormon sects, often most notably the Church of the Firstborn of the Fulfillment of the Times. This conflict led to a series of violent and brutal murders, often carried out by LeBaron's followers at his command. It is estimated that more than 20 people were killed during this period as a result of the rivalry. Ervil LeBaron's most notorious act was ordering the assassination of Rulon Alred, leader of a rival group, in 1977. LeBaron was eventually arrested and convicted in 1980 for his role in the murder of Alred, receiving a life sentence in prison. He continued to exert control over his sect behind bars until his death in 1981, at which point his brother, Joel LeBaron, took over his leadership of the group. Adolfo C., often referred to as the godfather of Monster Muertos, was a Mexican-American serial killer and cult leader who operated in Mexico during the 1980s. He was the leader of a cult known as the Narco-Satanists, or the Devil's Cult. Constantinos' crimes involved human sacrifice, drug trafficking, and religious and occult beliefs which hurt people around him. Constanzo was born in Miami, Florida in 1962, and he was of Cuban and Puerto Rican descent, and he became involved in the occult and Santeria practices, and he later fused these beliefs with his involvement in drug trafficking and organized crime. He claimed to have supernatural powers and convinced his followers that rituals and human sacrifices were necessary to protect their drug operations. The cult conducted a series of ritualistic human sacrifices, usually involving the victims being tortured and mutilated. Constanzo's belief that such sacrifices would provide him with supernatural protection and success in his criminal activities. The crimes came to light in 1989 after Constanzo and his cult engaged in a shootout with Mexican police. During the confrontation, Constanzo ordered one of the followers to kill him, and he died by S-word. His followers were arrested and led investigators to the locations of several bodies of the cult's victims. Adolfo Constanzo's case is one of the most gruesome and bizarre serial killer cases in Mexico's history. It revealed the dark and violent world of cults and criminal organizations involved in drug trafficking and occult practices. Monster of Florence refers to a series of gruesome and unsolved murders that took place in and around Florence, Italy between 1968 and 1985. The case is one of Italy's most notorious and mysterious unsolved crimes. The killer or killers targeted young couples who were often engaged in romantic activities in secluded areas in the hills and countryside surrounding Florence. The victims were typically shot with a .22 caliber firearm, and in many cases, the women were also as aid. The assailant often used the same firearm, leading to a belief that a single individual may have been responsible for some, if not all, of the murders. The investigation into the Monster of Florence case was complicated and marred by alleged police and judicial misconduct, as well as media sensationalism. Multiple suspects were arrested and put on trial, but no one was definitively convicted of the murders. Theories about the identity of the killer range from a lone individual to a group of individuals involved in a conspiracy. The Monster of Florence case has inspired books, documentaries, and extensive media coverage. It remains an unsolved mystery, and the true identity of the killer or killers remains a subject of speculation and intrigue. Oakland County Child Killer, also known as the Babysitter Killer, is an unidentified serial killer responsible for the abductions and murders of at least 4 children in Oakland County, Michigan between 1976 and 1977. The victims were all young children, and their murders shocked the local community and garnered national attention. The known victims of the Oakland County Child Killer are Mark Stebbins, and he was abducted in February 1976, Jill Robinson, abducted in December 1976 as well, Kristen McKeck, abducted in January 1977, and Timothy King, abducted in March 1977. All the victims were abducted and held captive for several days before their bodies were discovered in various different locations in Oakland County. Their murders have never been solved, and the killer has been identified or apprehended. The investigation into the Oakland County Child Killer case was one of the largest and most extensive in Michigan's history, involving multiple law enforcement agencies and drawing significant media attention. Despite various leads, tips, and suspects, the case remains open and unsolved, with several individuals being considered as possible suspects over the years, but no one really knows. And the case continues to haunt the community, and efforts to solve it persist, including new developments in forensic technology and renewed public interest. Zebra Murderers, also known as the Zebra Killers, refers to as a series of racially motivated murders that occurred in San Francisco, California in the early 1970s. The perpetrators were a group of African American men who targeted white individuals for violence and murder. The name Zebra Killings came from the police radio channel used to refer to the case. Between late 1973 and early 1974, a group of men associated with a cult called the Death Angels went on a killing spree, targeting Caucasians with the specific intent of murder and as many white people as possible. The assailants believed that they would achieve a form of spiritual salvation by committing these murders. The victims were often randomly chosen and attacked with firearms, knives, and other weapons. The Zebra Killings created a climate of fear and tension in San Francisco, and law enforcement agencies worked intensively to apprehend the perpetrators. Several suspects were arrested, and a number of them were convicted for their roles in the murder. The case eventually resulted in a series of trial, and the Zebra Killings remain a dark chapter in the history of crime in the United States, illustrating the devastating impact of racially motivated violence and the necessity of law enforcement agencies to bring perpetrators to justice. And that wraps up the serial killer Iceberg. I really hope you enjoyed, and rest in peace to all the victims to these horrible people and murderers. And thank you all for watching, and subscribe, like, and comment on the video, ideas for the future, and feedback. And like I said, thank you all for watching. It means the world. And until next time, see ya.